Welcome back, and what a delight to have in the studio with us, Patrick Doyle. He's a counselor with Veritas Counseling, and every time he's on the air, wow, a lot of things happen. And we're here to talk about a subject I think that will be pretty impacting to a lot of people, and it's a big one. I don't know if we can cover it in the short time we have, but it's called unsafe relationships. Mm-hmm. And you want to describe that? What is an unsafe relationship?
Last time I was here, I talked about, one of the things I talked about was people denying their instincts or their spirit or their gut. And I got a lot of feedback on that. And so this is one of the main ingredients that allows people to stay in relationships that are unsafe, is that someone that you're in a relationship is doing something to you that's harmful. And you feel the harm. It's not extreme, might be mild, but it's consistent. And you're like, oh, you're inside, you're like, oh, that wasn't very nice, or that wasn't right, or oh, they didn't mean it. You start to rationalize, you start to justify, you start to deny the harm that that person is doing, and then that gives them license. It's all unspoken. And then they keep taking ground, keep taking ground, keep taking ground until the person feels trapped, they feel overwhelmed. Then they say something, and the person who says something with more intensity than is, probably appropriate because they've been holding it in. Then the person who's been harming them says, well, look at you. And they don't take any responsibility, and thus the cycle continues. And so one of the things I see in the church particularly, Perry, is that people, because of their Christianity, feel like they can't say anything that will cause a problem. And I'm here to say that the best and most loving thing that someone can do if they're in a relationship with someone who's hurting them is stop them.
If not, your whole life is filled up with appointments of people who are on the other side of that.
Exactly. I have full calendar of people who have been mistreated. And here's the other thing I would say is a rule of thumb for someone who's in a relationship. They're not sure what's going on, or they think there's trouble, but they're not clear. Number one rule of an unsafe person is they don't ever take responsibility for anything. They rationalize, they minimize, they justify, they spiritualize, they deny. They never look you in the eye and go, when I said X, Y, or Z to you, I was wrong. It was my fault. I'm broken. I'm convicted by that. I don't want to be that way. I'm going to change. And the motivation stays with the offender. The person who's being offended doesn't have to provide the motive for the other person to change. And what I see all the time is people get into this situation, the person that's being offended, harmed, is the one who has to always be responsible for making it okay. So in God's economy, if someone's being harmful, doing something wrong to someone else, it's their responsibility to come to terms with their own sin, with their own wrong. And you can never be responsible for someone else's sin.
Well, boy, you've opened up a can of worms. But here's the frustration I've learned through this: that when you first realize that there is an unsafe situation going on here, you're hearing it from one side.
Yep.
And you can be passionately drawn into it. And then I've learned, I thought, okay, I just got to take this a little bit and get the other side to find out who really is the offender here.
Yep, exactly.
Because if you don't,
it could be a big mess.
It could be a big mess.
But I've seen it over and over and over again, Perry, where the person who's the offender is particularly smooth.
Yeah.
They got a silver tongue. They can talk a blue streak, whatever, however you want to put it.
Or they're avoidant.
But they never actually take responsibility. If the person you're with is continually harmed, except for in rare occasions where someone is highly pathological, but then there's going to be all kinds of other problems. So, when you're in a relationship and you feel unsafe, that's the first thing you have to take seriously. Look, let's vet it.
What would be unsafe? I mean, what are you sensing?
So here's the classic scenario. Somebody that you're in a relationship with is liked by others. They have a good reputation among other people. They're charming. They're kind to other people. The door shuts, and now
they're another person.
And they never leave a mark. I wish sometimes people would walk into my office with a black eye. And it would be like, okay, now we know what's going on. But when they have all this harm that you can't I don't have a video camera. I don't know but I always can tell the signs of someone who's being regularly harmed, because they can never get any resolution. Here's a person sitting in my house who desperately wants to resolve the relationship, and they can't, because the other person will never take responsibility. So it always leads back to that, is the person willing to take responsibility? Here's what I see a lot of that creates a lot of difficulty, is there's false humility. There's worldly sorrow. There's not conviction and repentance.
Boy, we ought to do shows on those two right there.
Exactly. Yeah. Because if a lot of people are desperate for things to get back together, and so when the person gives them that false humility, they're so desperate they just take it in. But when they do that, the person who's the offender, the harmer, is emboldened by that.
All right, so I'm also hearing you say that the offender won't take responsibility.
Nope.
All right, so that ought to tell the offended person that you're dealing with something that's going to escalate.
Exactly, and see, but most of the time, here's the other side of that, because the person who's been harming them is always blaming them, undermining them, they start to doubt their own instincts. And when they start to doubt their own instincts, the offender takes full charge. And so then I've seen it happen for years, where a person is trying to work it out, but they just keep getting overwhelmed by the person's accusations. You know, the offender says, well, that's not okay that you did that. And the person blows up and points the finger and says, well, you, but because and you, and because and you. And then the person who brought it up is like, oh, no, and they back up. And now the person who was an offender is getting off scot-free, and so it escalates. But, you know, sometimes it gets to the physical realm, but what I'm talking about is mostly emotional. And I've known situations where people are in relationships where that emotional abuse takes place for years, and no one knows.
Yeah.
Except for the person that's being offended, and maybe a couple of other people, but there's not enough evidence. Everybody's like, well, you know, maybe there's nothing actionable. So it's not like there's a smoking gun. So everybody's like, I don't know.
If the person that's being offended doesn't do something, it leads to unbelievable damage, not only to themselves, but you're being complicit to the other person, to the offender.
That's right.
But here's the situation. I've had them in my office where they thought they were losing their mind.
That's the other sign, Perry. It's the other sign. If you start to feel crazy in a relationship, I've talked to people who are very smart people, very capable people,
but they can't handle it.
And they come in and they're like, I think I'm going to lose my mind. I think I'm going to lose my mind. And I'm like, here's my rule of thumb. People say I'm confused. I have a different definition for confused. So most of the people I talk to are very capable people. They can have a conversation, they can follow along, they come to the right conclusions. They're capable people. If you're confused most of the time when you have a conversation with one person, it's not because you're confused, it's because you're being manipulated.
Okay, let me take a break there, because that's one of the other attributes of an abuser, so to speak, is manipulation. All right, we're talking about unsafe relationships. We're not going to leave you hanging here. We're going to kind of give you some tools on what to do if you feel like you are in one.
Right.
We'll be right back with Patrick Doyle.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at thedove.us.
Okay, we're back with Patrick Doyle. We're dealing with a subject called unsafe relationships, and he's done a pretty good job laying the foundation down on just what those are and how confusing and manipulative they can become. I've had people in my office that literally thought they were losing their mind. They were trying their best. They kept getting pushed back. And it's hard when the other person won't come in. And so you're dealing with something. How much is the person you're seeing adding to the problem? You know the drill.
Yeah, I do.
And so, but manipulation. Isn't that one of the big indicators?
Yep, it is. But you see, for many people, it's hard because what they see is the person who's doing the harm, other people like. And so the person goes out in the community and they're just this great person. And then they come home and they're not. And so the person that's being offended or harmed is kind of confused, like, well, maybe it's just me. Well, yeah, it is just you, but it's not you, it's them that they're just mistreating. They don't treat other people the way they're treating you, which is why it's confusing, because they're like, well, you know, and then you add on top of that, the person who's doing the harm is undermining the victim on a regular basis emotionally. So many people always ask me, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Well, the short answer is get away from the person that's harming you. You got to have some boundaries.
Isn't that the grenade in the campfire?
Many times, but I can just tell you from lots of experience where people have left the manipulative abuser and it's 2 weeks and they can't believe how much peace they have. I mean, there's difficulty because of the separation, but the fact that they're away from the person who's undermining them, they start to return to feeling better.
Okay, I tell you another scenario that kind of plays into this. On a couple occasions, I was the one that, and I'm not a counselor, I just get sucked into these things. So I just maybe call him, don't call me. And that is that when I confronted the abuser, there was a total meltdown. They had no idea it was happening. They didn't see themselves doing it. And it seemed to stem back to a low self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, you know, I think rarely, if the person claims faith, rarely are they unaware.
Yeah.
Now, there are many people who claim faith that it's a complete lie. They don't. Okay. There's no.
And given that definition, the ones that I did confront were people of faith. They just didn't know.
Yeah. And I would say, if you don't know and you're a person of faith, I got to question your faith, because how can you mistreat somebody that long and God not tell you? So your denial system is very significant. And so then I've had this discussion with countless people where, you know, they're like, well, blah, 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 God, blah, 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 God. I'm like, well, listen, if you're God's child, you living in abject unawareness of another human being that you're married to will not happen as a result of His Spirit being in you. That's not how it works. Oh, well, so let's talk about why you don't see that. Let's talk about what you're denying.
Bingo.
Okay, so until that person takes responsibility, listen, I say this all the time. The Bible does not require reconciliation. It requires forgiveness. And forgiveness is a wholly separate thing from reconciliation. Reconciliation is only the result of the offender having a conviction that has with it contrition. And this is something else I want to talk about real quickly. Is that,
Can I make a little addendum there? That doesn't mean, doesn't take from the biblical term of reconciliation, which is reconciling people to Christ.
Right. No. This is reconciling relationships.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So,
thank you.
But I hear it all the time that, you know, because you're a Christian, you're required to stay in the negative relationship.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Boy, then when you get them and I get them.
Right. Okay, so if someone is convicted from God, not trying to mitigate their consequences, they're convicted by God. That happens when God convicts someone. It's not because their spouse or the person they're harming is upset. It's separate from that. It's a spiritual thing. With conviction, godly sorrow, as the Bible calls it, always comes contrition. Okay, contrition isn't something we talk much about, and frankly, it's kind of rare in my experience. So contrition is this idea that I am so broken by what I have done in offending God and hurting the people around me, that I am profoundly, behaviorally, not words, I'm behaviorally motivated to show you, the person I've harmed, behaviorally, that I'm so sorry and I'm different. And the motivation is in me. It's not something you got to keep feeding. It's something that's in me. And so I tell this story all the time. When God convicted me about my porn addiction, and I got sober from that, and I was sober almost a year, and then I went back for almost a year and lied to my accountability group and all that. Then I confessed to my wife a second time, which I thought would be the end of my marriage. But one of the things that Catherine has said is that the fact that it was within me, it was my conviction, and she never had to manage any of that. That she saw God working in that, changing me. I was broken by it. I didn't want to do that. I was wrestling. Okay, that conviction and contrition behaviorally, she never had to ask me to go to a meeting. She never had to ask me to talk to anybody. She never had to ask me to pray about it. I was like, I got to deal with this. So that conviction signals to the other person that there's something good, transformative happening within me, which then allows them to open up and start to trust a little. If you don't see that contrition, you have no business reconnecting or making yourself vulnerable. You have to keep the boundary up. And this is where it's so hard for people, because a lot of their training is you don't do that.
Yeah. What happens, what can you say to the person that they know that they're in this unsafe relationship?
Yeah.
But they're slowly becoming immune to it.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that a real warning sign?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I see it a lot as people just become really despondent. They just kind of give up and they just feel hopeless and trapped, which would be another sign. If you're in a relationship that brings you to hopelessness and feeling trapped, that's not how relationships are supposed to make you feel.
Right.
That's not supposed to be the end of the relationship. So, yeah, because if you go up that ramp enough times to try to fix it, and every time you just get pulverized or turned away or disappointed or reconvinced how crazy you are for thinking that, and I've heard it 1,000 times. Every time the person brings up the issue, the offender turns it around back on them. Blame shifting is one of the #1 things they do. I tell people, they have responsibility Teflon, and you have responsibility Velcro. So, and if that's the case, that's a sign you're in an unsafe relationship. Now, unsafe relationships, there is a spectrum, mild, extreme. But if you're on the spectrum, it's a bad deal. And eventually, if you start with mild, you're going to end up in a much worse place. Unsafe relationships do not stay the same. They progress every time. Because people who are taking advantage of another person, that is a snowball that gathers mass. And so one of the worst things you can do as someone is in a relationship with somebody who's taking advantage of you is give them power.
All right, before we run out of time, if somebody feels that they just wore out from this, they've been putting up from it, they may feel like they become immune to it.
Right.
It's easier, when we use the term easier, to stay in the relationship and live under the same roof than it is to confront it. But they're just running out of gas from it. They're not looking forward to going home at night or whatever the situation may be.
The person coming home, whatever.
What's the first thing they ought to do?
Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to talk to somebody who understands this stuff, and you got to start getting some validation. And I've worked with people for 1, 2, 3 years before they're ready to confront, because they're so broken down, and it takes me convincing them, really, in the long run, that what they're seeing is true. Yeah, if that's happening, that's the right conclusion. And then they go to the person they're with, and that person undoes all that, and then they come back, and I'm like, no, that's the right conclusion.
Yeah.
And the other thing about this is I've seen a lot of people in the church use Scripture to justify their harm of others.
Well, that's spiritual abuse on top of.
So then we get into that, right? So now, not only is the victim, crazy for bringing it up, now they're bad with God. So where are they going to go? So they're the problem. So now the person who's being harmed has no place to stand. So that's why you got to get with someone who can help you vet out all those things you feel. Because internally, it's going to be really hard. And I've heard this hundreds of times, Perry, over the years, from the benefit that you have provided you provided the world with this benefit, and I give you the credit, is you put up all these shows for free. Owing to your argument before I came on about the LPT TV stations, it's a very important thing. People say it all the time, I heard you on the Dove, and when I heard you talk about this, it resonated with me as I have to do something about this. It was me hearing me talk about somebody as being unsafe within a Christian context is what got them to start thinking differently. Okay, and so having that connection is hugely important for the victim. They have to have somebody they think they can trust.
Okay, because that was the point I really want to make clear here before the show. We run out of time, and that is, if you feel trapped in this unsafe, don't go at this alone.
No, you can't.
Seek somebody out that you can trust, a counselor.
And you have to vet that trust, Perry.
Yeah.
You can't just blindly trust someone. You have to slowly check them out. Because I've seen this, and I hate to say this, but it's true. Many times I've seen people go to their pastors, and their pastors completely mishandle it, and then it's worse.
Yeah.
And it's not a short-term deal.
And it's a serious thing. I think it needs to be taken care of. All right. So if they go to someone and you vet the person that you're going to go to and unload this situation, is it working towards? An encounter? I mean, so all of a sudden is it heading towards an intervention? Where's this going?
It all depends on what the offender does. If the offender has any semblance of repentance, then we're going to work towards restoration. Mm-hmm. If the offender is just continued in the denial, rationalizing, minimizing, all that stuff, then we have to help set safe boundaries and see what God does. If God convicts that person, then we try to work towards coming together. If that person isn't convicted, we figure out how to live in a safe way, waiting. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that means they split up. Sometimes that means they're just willing to wait. It always varies.
All right. So one of the hardest parts of this is if the offender is at the same time claiming to be spiritual.
Yes.
That's the one you really need some good counseling.
It is. And here's the deal.
You got 20 seconds.
Behavior always tells a story. I don't care what you say. If your behavior isn't convicted, isn't soft, isn't changed by God, then the person who's being offended should not trust it.
All right, thank you, bud.
You bet.
All right, Veritas Counseling in Jacksonville. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Focus Today.